Hi everyone, it's Jerry. Let's have a look at another game between AlphaZero, playing on the white end, and Stockfish. We have another Queen's Indian defense. Light square bishops competing for the long diagonal. Bishop b4 check, bishop d2. And in the previous game I reviewed between these two, the bishop drops back to e7. Not here. Dark square bishops are exchanged. Queen recapturing. It's the queen knight who wants to post up on c3. This is a strong square. d5, both sides castle. C takes d5, e takes d5, knight c3, knight b to d7, and b4. I like this move b4. These guys here will help to combat black's queenside structure. This guy's fighting for c5, and also b2 is now vacated for the queen. She, surprisingly enough, functions very well, even if just for a short time, from the b2 post, X-raying the unprotected bishop, and maybe more importantly, helping to facilitate an always desirable move like knight to e5. Whenever you have this kingside fianchetto, a knight to f3, or excuse me, a knight on f3, you want to, at some point, play your knight to e5 and say, my knight has been improved and my bishop can see the world. A queen from b2 helps out with this move. Continuing, we have c6, queen to b2. a5 is met with b5. b5 is essentially saying, no, I'm not going to help your rook out. I'm not going to allow your a-pawn to make a capture. c5 is the follow-up. And from here, white, I guess, is kind of treating this as if it's just a true hanging pawn structure. Just as if it's c5 and d5, those pawns just by themselves. C5, d5 without the b6 and d4 pawn. At any point, it could change into exactly that after d takes c5, b takes c5. So in other words, the white rooks are going to post up on the c and d files. Rook c1, queen e7, knight a4 places a constraint on this guy. He now has a job. Rook to b8, rook f to d1, and on this move 16, black changes the structure with c4. And we pretty much play within this structure on the queen side for great majority of the game for sure. It'll change a little bit on the king side, but if c4 isn't played here, I just want to touch on how play might develop. These are important things to assess. How might play continue for just a few moves if c4 isn't played here? Suppose something natural, like getting this guy involved, half open file. This is how play might develop. It can open up a great deal, and white is the side who would stand better. Currently down a pawn, but the pawn will be won back, and every white piece is fantastic. White also has a flight square. Black needs to invest some time for that. This would be desirable for white. So, black takes this opportunity to shut things down. c4, acquire a protected passed pawn. This is a very valuable pawn, but this queen knight will be the one who is responsible for making sure he doesn't go any further. And it's the queen knight who will exert a great amount of pressure on the black center from c3. Continuing, knight to e5 and f4. So really super gluing this knight into e5. Rook f to d8. Just centralizing a little bit. The queen has done her job supporting a knight to e5 move. There's nothing happening on the b file anymore, so play is now turning towards the king side of the board here, with all these pawns basically being fixed at this stage. Rook f1, queen to d6, a4. Again, nothing going on here. This is a kingside game. There's some space that black has with the c4 pawn, but he's under. There's some space. He's passed, but he's under control. White also has space with b5. There's no action going on the queen side. So who is better on the king side? It's white who slowly grabs a little bit of space. Rook c8, e3, and now in comes g4. Little by little, the black pieces are finding themselves rocked back. f5 is met with f6, knight f3, and let's just pause for a moment. We're 26 moves in. This is a 100-move game. There's a lot of maneuvering that comes about from this stage. Who stands better and why? Again, the queen side is shut down. If we have a look at the key 16 squares here, what do you notice about these 16 squares? You would like to have both knights somewhere in these 16 squares. White already has that. Look at the black knights. Soon one of them will be able to occupy an okay square, a good square, on d6. But aside from that square, one of the knights is always going to be a bit clumsy. The e7 knight in particular is not a very well-placed piece, and nor is the bishop on b7. The knight on c3 exerts pressure on d5, so will the bishop, and not long off, the knight on f3 will do one better, by improving one rank, getting out of the bishop's way, and there'll be yet another piece, putting pressure on d5. Continuing, queen to d7, so what can we say? White has a much more superior pawn structure in this middle game position. Queen d7 follows. Queen f2, little repositioning, fighting for e4, and some pressure on d5. So these guys are always going to have to stick around, watching over that point. Rook to f8, queen g3. Eventually, we're going to have the queens exchanged in this one. Not too much is changing with the structure. Queen a3, this is, I don't even know how to describe this, just some kind of silly active move. I don't know how to describe this. There's no issue with the queen here. She's not coordinated with any other black piece. White, on the other hand, has perfect coordination. Rooks defending each other, the knights defended, a-pawns defended. Everything is strung together for white. So, following up, we have h5, queen c7, throwing a couple punches. And from here we have queen d6, and the queens get exchanged. If you're wondering why is queen takes bishop not played in this position, it's because we would have this pretty weird variation where the queen could actually be given up, and we obtain a roughly equal position with queen takes, pawn takes, and yeah, don't ask me how exactly to assess this position. It's pretty crazy. Evaluation at depth 23 is saying that it's equal. Apparently AlphaZero sees better in simply exchanging queens here and continuing with now knight g3, preparing to win this pawn. And one more change of the structure here. So this is an important moment, move 37. I touched on this moment here with c4. You know, if c4 isn't played and instead rook here, how might play develop? Well, in this game, we have h4 played. Why is maybe this capture not played? The best explanation I could give for this is that the h file is now opened, and white will be able to make better use of the h file than black. In fact, it's not long off before you would see something like the knight posting up on f4. 3 minor pieces would then be striking at d5, which would require the support of at least one of the black rooks. That would be an inconvenience for black, and white could then double up on the h-file and probably do something there. Black sees it best to keep things a bit closed with h4. Knight h5 follows. Knight g5. This is black's best piece here. So, putting a constraint on one of the white pieces, observing a big gap in white's position. This is one of the weakest squares in white's camp. Okay, so too is d3. That's a square that's difficult to reach for black, but certainly e4. The knight, the rook, the pawn are all converging there. The bishop has some influence as well on e4. So some more maneuvering. And what more to add here? Bishop h1, move 42, is actually throwing a punch. You see the threat here. Vacating g2 for what reason? The threat here is to simply scoop up the pawn in 2 moves. Now, Stockfish allows this. We're just a couple moves away, and AlphaZero is going to be up a pawn. So this definitely caught my attention, and I wondered why not try to save this pawn. In the game, we had rook d6, and simply knight g2, and knight takes h4 follows. So, can black do something different? So this is one of the last points in this 100-move game that I really want to touch on. Because from there, once AlphaZero is up a pawn, I don't know, it just seems like a too simple a conversion for AlphaZero when AlphaZero is up a pawn. So the thing I would like to question here is what would happen if the rook played to h8, preparing to meet knight g2 with king to g8. A good way forward for white in this position would be to get rid of black's best piece, this guy here on g5. And who's going to do that? The queen knight. That's going to be the one that, this is the piece that's going to remove black's best defender. Knight b1 to d2 to f3. Let me play some moves out. Would play out something like this. I believe that this would be a good plan. Not knight to f3 just yet. Instead, knight h5. So now the rook is cut off. And let's get one more move in there. Let's say rook to e8, since the rook can't defend this point anymore. Knight f3, knight takes, bishop takes. And you can see now that soon we're going to have a knight on f4. Exerting pressure on d5, the bishop is there. You do a knight comparison, knight on f4 versus a knight on e7. And without the knight on g5, there's now even a nice pawn break at some stage white can go forward with in the form of g5. Opening up h5 for the bishop. This is a way forward for white if black tries to hang on to the h-pawn. In the game, it's rook to d6, and white, in just a couple moves, simply picks up the h-pawn. Pawn takes pawn, g takes. If the knight captures, well, black would be helped out. This knight is a dead piece, and the rook would then be brought to life, so pawn takes pawn. And let's just see how white converts from here. Rook to g2. This knight is enormous. He didn't have to make a lot of moves. And he had that idea in case black tried to hang on to the pawn. It was the queen knight who would be there to kind of crack the position open. So king f6. He also has another maneuver still in him. Bishop f3, just improving little by little. A bishop from e2 functions very well. At some stage there can be an e4 pawn break and maybe a timely bishop takes pawn move, who knows? Maybe if the king is on a light square, that move would hit with check then. So it's also getting out of the rook's way. Continuing bishop g4, knight c8, bishop f3, and another pawn break, h4, and the white pieces simply come to life from here. If pawn takes pawn, this rook is getting way too active with rook to g6, so black tries a pin. White simply pushes, so now there's 2 passers. 4 pass pawns total. But the black pawns are really posing no danger to Team White. And this king, if he's ever dislodged, this guy's going to run really fast. Rook to e8, bishop g2, knight e7, h6, rook h8, rook h3, rook h7, and king g1. One little prep move, the king is getting a little bit closer towards the center. Maybe in some cases this pawn would like to be defended by the king. And the final maneuver here, knight to d1. Preparing knight f2 into g4, that would be a killer. Dislodging the king, and then there's another pawn that's ready to step foot on the 6th rank. So g4 is played, rook h5. This pawn could never be successfully captured. There's always some way to capitalize on the pin. e4, knight to e3. Currently, it doesn't even have enough attackers on it, but the pin could always be exploited if it's ever captured. g3 follows, so can't make use of f2, so the knight is just going to return to c3 and then simply scoop up the g3 pawn. He's way too overextended at this stage. Knight e2, the h pawn is exchanged, g pawn is picked up, white remains a pawn ahead, and from here, just improve the kings. Knights are now gone, he did his job, and this guy here is a big issue in this endgame. Simply unproductive. That's a bad bishop who's... What can he do? He has one square to go to. No good. Rook h1 follows, and from here it's just a mopping up of the pawns. He could go nowhere. White controls this square, and if he tries to get too active, of course he can't go here, but if he tries to get active, this rook can always go to a7 and keep pressure on the bishop, and the rook always has to have the responsibility to defend the bishop, so let's just see the conversion from here. Another 25 moves before resignation. We've seen this happen before. It just gets to a point in the endgame where the pawns just fall one by one, and there's just not much that you can do. Playing against a really bad piece in this game, the light square bishop, and not too much longer. We're going to have resignation in this one. Coming up right at move 100 after a6. It's at this point that Stockfish throws in the towel. If the game did continue, playing it out straight to checkmate, this is just one of the many ways that it could have finished. Rook being captured, king creeping over, and the d-pawn running up a little bit with a pretty neat mate to finish it off. So, what more to say with this game?
Stockfish, my middle game structure was simply superior, and your bad bishop was very bad. Again.